Nigerians spent 40 trillion naira on consuming food and non-food items in 2019. This according to the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics 2019 Consumption Expenditure Pattern Report for the nation. How much of this 40 trillion naira was spent on food? How much was spent on non-food items? What do the spending patterns tell us about our economy? Joining us to answer these questions is Wilson Erumebor. He's an economist at the NESG, the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. Good morning to you, Wilson. Welcome to the show. Now, how much of this 40 trillion did Nigerians spend in 2019 on food items and non-food items?
Okay, so what we've seen from the report is that from the breakdown, so it shows that we spend more on food items than on non-food items. So food items out of the 40 trillion accounts for 57%. That's 23 trillion naira spent on food alone. So if you look at non-food items, that has about 43%. So which it has about 17 trillion, which is about 43%. So it tells you that perhaps we're spending more on food items than on non-food items, and that in itself has an implication as to more like how developed we are, because the more you make progress as a country, the lower the share of food as a percentage of total expenditure.
All right, thank you for that, Wilson. So the 23 trillion naira on food, what about that particular breakdown? How did that 23 trillion naira on food break down?
So we noticed from the data that about 20% of that 23 trillion naira was spent on, so you have food consumed outside of home. So we're talking about things like dinner, breakfast, or whatever, when you go to an eatery, a restaurant, to buy whatever, to consume that particular commodity. So it basically looks at most of the food items, but those that are spent outside of home. So it also includes things like alcohol, drinks, and all that. And we spent a whopping 4.6 trillion naira on food consumed outside of home. So if you look at, starchy roots, that's second on the list. Starchy roots, tubers, plantain, and you'd agree with me that these are, essential food commodities that Nigerians consume every day. So we spent about 2.5 trillion on that. So you have things like yam, cocoa yam, and the likes, and plantain. I know almost everybody loves plantain. So that accounted for a significant amount of what we spent. Rice, of course, not surprising, vegetables and all that. So you go down to the list, and then you have things like alcoholic drink, where we spent 150 billion naira on that for 2019, for the whole year.
Thank you so much. I can assure you plantain is a favorite of mine as well, Wilson. Now, so 23 trillion on food, so the remaining 17 trillion now was spent on non-food items. Well, what's the breakdown with the non-food and 17 trillion spent there?
Yes, so what for the non-food, we have most of it was spent on transport. So basically moving around, trying to commute from one place to another. A couple of regions like the Southwest, for instance, led in this particular aspect of transport. Interestingly, the second biggest item was on health. The third was on education. So, and then you have services. So you have telecoms, things like your internet, data connections, and other services, repair of, other computer items and all that. So those were categorized under services, insurance, and the likes. So fifth was rent, and then you have fuel, lights, and water, which accounted, and fuel and light, which accounted for 2 trillion, naira. So in all of these, the whole of this contributed about 43% to total spending for the year.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, I think you mentioned the Southwest a moment ago. As far as the regional breakdown, how did that look?
So across all the categories, the Southwest, came up on top in terms of the biggest spender, if you permit me to use that phrase. So the Southwest topped across all the different categories, so whether it's food, whether it's non-food. And it tells you, and of course, you know that Lagos is a big contributor within the Southwest region. So across all the commodities, Lagos was the main spender, and then then you have the South-South. So after the Southwest, you have the South-South. And then sometimes, in some cases, the other changes from there on where sometimes you have the Northwest, sometimes you have the Southeast, coming on board. So for food items, so you'd notice the Southwest spent 6.2 trillion naira, next to the South-South, which spent about 4.6 trillion on that. So across all the items as well, the Northeast came at the bottom. They spent the least. And this survey excluded Borno State, basically because of insecurity issues and all that. So that's how it went across the regions.
Thank you. So I'm guessing that for non-food expenditure, it pretty much would follow that same pattern as far as the regions.
Yes, exactly. So for non-food items too, it followed exactly the same pattern: the Southwest, the South-South, the Northwest, and the North Central, and then the Southeast, and then the Northeast. So there's that pattern. Sometimes this could be determined by your level of purchasing power across the region, depending on the item. Other times it depends on your population. So also depends on the item if you want to do a breakdown. So population plays a role. For instance, in the Northwest, you have a significant number of people, population, households, and all that. So spending on food was much higher than compared to a region like in the Southeast and in the North Central. So things like also purchasing power also come to play in terms of the order of ranking across the regions.
Okay, fantastic. Now, also, Wilson, when we look at these breakdowns for every category, and I'm sure, healthcare, entertainment, transport, and well, the Southwest leads, boosted by Lagos. What does this say about the competitiveness of the states, if you will, or perhaps the wealth of the inhabitants of the states, and whether or not Lagos can be given a run for its money down the line, if ever?
Well, Lagos is the biggest economy in the country. Lots of economic activities. If you look at it's even reflected in the state's revenue. So you have more of internally generated revenue than the allocations from the federal government and all. So there's Lagos has enjoyed that level of high population growth over time, with people coming in and coming into the state. Consistent leadership, I must say, as well, has led. But for across all the other states, some of them aren't lucky to have that. But in terms of competitiveness, I think the idea should not be to be like Lagos or to want to suppress or surpass Lagos as it were. More, it should be each state looking inwards and embracing their uniqueness. So, for instance, if a state is endowed with agriculture, that state can actually feed Lagos, and it's even happening. Lagos is not so strong in agriculture. Much of its food comes from, other regions and even neighboring states as well. So I think what we need to start looking at is how can these states harness these uniqueness, these resources that they have, and how can they, with have that ensured collaboration with the private sector, consistent one, to move away from a lot of informal type economic activities to big industrial activities that can, stimulate production outputs and aggregate demand within those states. So in some countries you'd have things like agricultural states, agric cities, states that are, in Borneo, Indonesia, it's known for oil palm, and they have one of the best, machineries, latest modern technologies. I think we can begin to look towards that direction. That what are the key resources and economic activities within a state that can make them competitive, and how can we begin to harness them rather than waiting for FAC allocations.
Thank you. Okay, so what do these consumption patterns tell us about developing economies versus developed economies as far as the spending is concerned?
So one of the key message that it tells us is the fact that we still spend 57% of our expenses, total expenditure on food. That in itself is worrisome because as countries make progress, as you become more developed, much of your income, much of your expenditure goes to non-food items, and food begins to have more lesser share. Not actually in absolute value. In terms of absolute value, you can spend more. Food spending would increase, but not as fast as non-food spending. So it should be. So in countries like, let's say, Brazil, for instance, food accounts for just 17% of what they spend. In South Africa, I think it's about 40% amongst the poor. And then even amongst the rich, you have things that are as low as 5%. So that tells you that even within Nigeria, within the state, richer regions would spend more on non-food items than on food items. And that's very clear. As if you look at data from Lagos, that came out very clearly. And even states like Delta, not so much spent more on food, but then the share was very close. As we make progress, we should start to see how to close that gap. So what it tells us from a policy side is we should start looking at how we can raise income and productivity of citizens, because as people get richer, as people are able to earn money, automatically these shares adjust. So raise income. There are things like universal basic cash transfers that government implements. More importantly, I think things like jobs, because that's the most sustainable way out of poverty. Create a friendly enabling environment for businesses. When businesses can create jobs, they can employ people and people can earn a living. Also, lastly, on skills development is also one key area that I think we need to focus more on, ensuring that people have the right skills to deliver and be more productive to the economy so they can earn income.
Fantastic. Okay, we've only got about a minute to go, Wilson. The last report we got was in 2009. Is there any hope we can get this on an annual basis, or am I being too hopeful?
Well, I think that that would be an ideal thing. I mean, from a very optimistic point of view. I mean, it would be nice to have this. If it can be done monthly, I mean, it would be nice to. But in a realistic sense, I don't think it's possible, especially because of the huge amount of resources that goes into this kind of survey. And again, I think as a country, we also need to start prioritizing funding data as such. So for now, I'm not quite sure we can get this on an annual basis, but with time, and I hope that when we have, when we can prioritize things like data, we can begin to put more resources so that we can fund such data like this, because it's very helpful for even government in terms of making policy decisions, and even for citizens as well, and businesses to also understand consumer profiling.
All right. Thank you so much, Wilson Erumebor, who is an economist with the NESG, the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, for taking us through the 40 trillion naira spent by Nigerians in 2019, coming from the NBS spending patterns report. Thank you so much.